Now that the election is over and we know where we stand with our new president-elect, it's time for us to look forward and try to figure out one of the toughest issues that came about in this year's election, which is the nation's economy. See, a lot of people, including myself, never really think about how our cities, states, and even our nation as a whole is performing financially. And we damn sure don't think about the ramifications that it has on us, its population. I came across this video that was posted by CNBC about 3 days ago discussing why 27 US states are going broke. I think it's important to discuss this topic because you guys need to start to consider how this is going to affect you in your future. And please believe me, it affects you more than you think. But before we get into this video, I want to congratulate a few beasters that have had tremendous success using my Dispute Beast platform. First up, we have Carl, who's increased his credit score across all 3 credit bureaus 484 points in just 2 months of using Dispute Beast. Up next, we have Lamont, who between TransUnion and Equifax has increased his credit score 200 points in just 3 months. And last but not least, we have Kenneth, who across all 3 credit bureaus has increased his credit score 534 points in just 3 months of using Dispute Beast. Listen, if you guys have been trying to figure out how to more efficiently and effectively challenge the negative items that have been reporting incompletely, inaccurately, and unverifiably on your credit reports, go over to beastdiy.com right now and check out my platform. You'll be able to dispute those items in just a few clicks with all 3 major credit bureaus, LexisNexis and Innovis, all the major third-party credit reporting agencies, as well as directly with the creditors and collectors themselves. You guys do yourself a favor and make the decision that thousands of people across the internet have made already and repair your credit on your own, on your time, in total control with Dispute Beast. Back to the video.
State governments in the U.S. are running out of cash.
After meeting our obligations, we have very little money left.
One count suggests that 27 states lack the necessary funds to pay their bills. The problem is most prominent in states like Connecticut, New Jersey, and Illinois.
Not only City of Chicago, but State of Illinois is running straight into a brick wall in terms of its finances. City of Chicago is facing a $1 billion deficit. The state's facing a massive deficit while also needing to bail out things like the Chicago Transit Authority. Chicago Public Schools is asking for a bailout. The state cannot afford these things.
States received about $800 billion from the federal government to kick off the decade. That spending obscured long-running issues.
What we're seeing is largely a return to earth from those pandemic surpluses.
You know, we saw a big increase in income taxes. There was really like a bit of an economic boom.
States now are working with tighter budgets as the country's population and infrastructure ages. Even economically powerful states see trouble ahead.
To the degree that the states are relying on federal aid, it becomes a daisy chain of vulnerability.
State governments account for 15% of the nation's economic output, and they employ 13% of the U.S. workforce. So why are so many state governments going broke? And what can they do to repair their finances?
So when we're looking at Illinois, the state itself, it's been one of those states that's been impacted not only by the age of its state and its failing infrastructure as that state continues to naturally grow in its population, but it's been absolutely hammered by almost 50,000 new migrants that came into the city unplanned. So when you look at the cost of housing those people, feeding those people, educating those people and the like, on top of the others that are already populating that city, you're looking at a financial plan that simply cannot be sustained. And this is not only going on in Chicago, which is the largest city in Illinois. It's going on in New York, Los Angeles, as well as other large sanctuary cities in the United States.
State governments pay for much of the nation's systems of education, healthcare, transportation, and public housing, but they receive tremendous amounts of help from the federal government to do that. In 2022, federal grants covered 38% of total spending from state governments. That was a bit more than usual.
During the pandemic, we saw a lot of one-time revenue, a lot of one-time expenditures that kind of had the effect of obscuring these long-term challenges that states faced.
The ensuing economic boom strengthened state coffers and increased revenues. The increase in revenue helped state leaders lower taxes and increase spending.
We, you, all of us together, delivered both the largest tax cut ever by a huge margin and the largest increase in teacher salaries in our state's history.
We understand that that's, something that is politically palatable, particularly in the time of an election. It is something that if those receipts decline, we may see some future imbalances between, expenditures and revenues that states will have to correct.
Virtually every state made a tax cut. In some cases, this is a very intentional plan for states to spend down these unexpectedly high revenues. On the other side, this could really reflect tightening budget conditions and states needing to draw on those dollars to help make ends meet right now.
But the federal funds given to states will run out in 2026 as a cost of living crisis hits many parts of the country.
For too many, the cost of living is too high.
The higher cost.
So this is where it's going to get messy. When these federal funds dry up, especially when these states have become dependent on this type of support, a lot of these states are going to have to make some really tough decisions. It's one thing to promise benefits like pensions and be able to fund public projects during a surplus time, but sustaining them without the backup funding, that's where the real challenge begins. Illinois, for instance, has had pension issues for years, and that's no secret. And if you're familiar with the public sector, you know exactly the kind of ticking time bomb that pensions have become. The promise of lifetime benefits, when you think about it, is really dope in theory, especially as the population ages. But when that money starts to dry up, who's going to be left holding the bag? You see, people in my generation have figured out that shit ain't gonna roll. But for the older people who have no time left to accumulate any more funds, it's going to become incumbent on the rest of us to try to figure it out for them. And by the rest of us, I mean taxpayers of all kinds, and that includes current employees as well as retirees. We all got a problem.
Cost of living is making some state leaders consider tax relief. That includes places like Wyoming and North Dakota.
States that do well are North Dakota, Idaho, South Dakota. And what these states really have in common is that they have a relatively limited fiscal footprint.
Many policymakers across the states, they did pretty well managing the pandemic era budget surpluses. A huge looming question out there is around the long-term affordability of the tax cuts and spending increases that were enacted.
State governments also have to manage long-running financial liabilities.
There are states like Illinois, Connecticut, and New Jersey. While these states really have accumulated a lot of debt after the great financial crisis, the main reason for their weak fiscal stance is the pension obligation.
Roughly 86% of public employees receive pensions. These are retirement plans that provide guaranteed income for life.
State and cities, in order to attract public servants, maybe paying them less money than they would make in the private sector, provide generous pensions, and they ended up getting behind.
If pension liabilities are fully accounted for, as many as 27 states lack the money needed to pay their bills.
What goes a little bit under the radar is that pension liabilities are an extremely expensive form of debt. The portion of the pension that is unfunded increases by 7% every single year.
This debt leaves states with less money to fund public programs.
So we're talking hospitals, we're talking about roads, we're talking about schools.
Take Illinois, for example, which owes money to former employees, but has less than half of the funds raised to pay them back.
We've seen analysis from JP Morgan that says in order to actually fund these enormously generous promises that were made decades ago, you would have to double the state income tax overnight in Illinois.
Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has steadily kept spending on areas like roads, in addition to...
Oh my God, dude. Could you imagine waking up and your income tax bracket was 12%, and all of a sudden now you're not making any more money, but your state income tax goes to 24%. Or if it was 7%, it goes to 14%. If it was 5%, it goes to 10%. Regardless of whatever the number is, your income, wherever you live, does not increase. Your obligations, whatever they may be, do not increase. Rent does not go down. The utilities does not go down. Your car payment, insurance, none of that changes, right? None of that decreases. But the amount of money that the state is taking from you, if your state has state income tax, doubles overnight. That could be crippling for everybody involved. And keep in mind, most people who make 6 figures a year still live paycheck to paycheck, so they're not absolved either. This is something that has become currently untenable across the United States, especially in your more populous states. So then what happens is people start to leave the state, especially high earners. Because when you have a high earner who's making 7 figures a year and they're already in the top tax bracket and you double their state income tax, they can afford to get up and bounce. They can leave right now. So when your highest earners who are funding the lowest earners get up and get out, now as a state with that big massive deficit to retirees who you have told they have a certain pension coming, now that becomes far more crippling.
Penny, we are still working together, saving important things for our state.
This requires tax increases to balance the budget. But that option may not be available to a state like Illinois, which already has relatively high tax rates.
Using taxes to raise additional revenue is limited.
Higher taxes tend to make people move, especially top earners. That's according to studies on states like California.
When the marginal tax rate increases by 3%, California loses about 0.8% in the tax base in the top income bracket. That's actually substantial because it's like 1% of the tax base in the very high bracket, which for the most part accounts for the majority of tax revenues overall.
Moving forward, state governments must respond to emerging risks like more extreme weather, an aging population, and migration.
Migration, I believe, is going to be one of the biggest issues that will face the country.
In the 2020s, many Americans moved from high-tax areas into states like Florida, Texas, and North Carolina.
Coincidentally, those states that have those low income taxes, of course, they're attractive because of the climate, but they also have a high degree of climate risk. That's where it's going to be a real test for politicians in terms of managing a state budget.
Florida, for example, has drawn many people with its lack of state income taxes and business-friendly policies, but it sees risks ahead.
Florida is being challenged by a few factors that may be outside of policymakers' control. Within Florida's long-term budget assessment, they actually highlight Medicaid as a growing fiscal concern for the state. And of course, climate change and hurricanes hitting the state of Florida is a real concern.
The federal government generally handles over 75% of disaster-related costs. Agencies like the Federal Emergency Management Authority, or FEMA, could quickly run out their budgets and require further funds from Congress.
I think anyone that's relying on FEMA to be leading the response, that is not the way proper storm response is.
There's a great concern of what that future risk is to the federal government, and that FEMA always becomes the bailout for people who haven't planned. It's a big number.
So when you look at places like Florida and Texas and other places like that, North Carolina, that might be decent tax havens for high earners, now you get into the fact that it's becoming almost uninhabitable because of the fact that insurance companies are bailing out on those states. They're no longer willing to invest into the real estate or into the auto markets of these states because of natural disasters and the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been taken out of the insurance industry because of these small areas. So now you have the tax haven states being pounded by natural disasters, and they're becoming uninhabitable. So what happens to the top earners from places like California? Well, now they're going to start to move to more rural areas like Wyoming. What happens to those places? Now they have to increase their footprint. Now they start to take on debt so they can build out their infrastructure and house more people. This is something that I'm starting to believe, taking a look at this video, has no solution.
Number that's being presented to the taxpayer ultimately.
Nearly all counties in the United States are exposed to some sort of climate hazard.
I don't think people always associate a rising number of heat days with climate. I think the Midwest, being exposed to extreme heat, it can compound other hazards, which can be particularly impactful to agriculture. Crop production in the Midwest does contribute to that gross state product. You know, we've seen a lot of food inflation over the last couple of years.
Right now, the market isn't pricing in climate risks into securities, into municipal bonds. And so this becomes a future potential bill for state and local governments. Even in North Carolina, where Helene went up and disaster struck, could anyone have really anticipated that? You need to check on your health of your infrastructure, and can it withstand a severe stress test?
The largest banks have to do stress tests coming out of the Great Recession. There's a similar concept that states actually do.
At least 20 states review their financial strength by conducting stress tests or long-term budget assessments. And all 50 are developing rainy day funds. These savings are used during economic downturns. Some states, like New Jersey, Montana, and Illinois, have very low savings in these funds. Other states, like Wyoming and Alaska, could finance their operations for months.
Alaska, very resource-rich state. A lot of its tax revenue is derived from oil prices and what's called severance taxes on that energy production. It really is a double-edged sword for a state like Alaska, as well as other states like North Dakota and Wyoming. This dependence on oil prices and on those severance taxes has really become unsustainable. point of optimism is that we're seeing more and more states do their assessment, do their homework, right, to understand whether they are on a fiscally sustainable trajectory these days.
For example, the state of Maryland found budget gaps in its long-term assessment conducted in 2022.
And to the state leaders' credit, they focused on finding longer-term solutions by raising revenue, some spending cuts.
This trend has contributed to strong credit ratings for states across the board.
When you're in a healthy condition, right, that's when you're supposed to be planning for adversity and not reacting to it. This is really an opportune time for those issuers who are in geographic areas of high degrees of climate risk.
The level of annual issuance of municipal debt may have to double from about 400 to 450 billion to between 800 and 900 billion annually for the assets, the public assets in the US to be adapted and more resilient to climate hazards.
68% of investment advisors in the United States see public debt as the top economic issue to the country.
I don't think politicians have any plan, really, to solve this in Illinois. And we saw a hint of this actually during the pandemic. Illinois was going to Congress asking for a $10 billion pension bailout.
So when you're considering investing in states or municipal bonds, high debt levels are a huge red flag. The lower a state's credit rating, the more they pay in interest. This costs them a lot more money in the long run. Just like when you take on bad debt in your personal life, this becomes an impossible cycle to break, especially without real fiscal reform.
That is really the only answer they have because it's so politically toxic to keep raising taxes on Illinois residents.
There are certainly tremendous challenges going forward. There's still like a $1.3 trillion of pension debt outstanding. So that's big relative to, the annual revenues that those states receive.
That's crazy. Looking at that number, $1.34 trillion. If that doesn't get your attention, I do not know what will. And as I stated in this video, it ain't going away by raising revenue. These are promises that have been made to public employees over the last few decades, and they have to be kept because these people rely on this money for survival. We straight up can't ignore this issue anymore, and the states are starting to tell on themselves because they can't solve it on their own. There are no policies that can be implemented. There are not enough taxes that can be put in place to make this go away. What we're seeing across the U.S. are structural budgetary issues that have to be faced by the public themselves, not by the government. When the states increase taxes and cut services to deal with their own debts, it affects all of us. And the hard truth is that the most populous states are facing difficult choices that are not going to be popular, but they're going to be necessary in order to avoid future crises. This is a wake-up call for us. If you're not preparing yourself by becoming more fiscally responsible, as well as finding ways to earn more income for your future retirement savings, you're making a huge mistake. A lot of these people have waited way too long to address this, and they're going to be facing dire consequences as such. Listen, if you guys like this style of video and you want me to do more financial content like this that I can break down and make if you guys like this style of video and you want me to do more content like this that is not necessarily credit related, but will help you see things from a different perspective when it comes to your financial future and how to prepare for it, do me a favor and like the video and leave a comment. And if you watch multiple of my videos, consider subscribing to the channel because YouTube tells me that most of the people who watch my videos are not subscribers. So help your boy out and help your friends and family too, because by subscribing to my content, you tell YouTube that it's useful. Because I know you can go anywhere on the internet for your financial information, but you're here with me. Be blessed.